It's time to begin session number 5. Uh, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Myung-hyun Yoon, National R&D Program Director for the area of Home Network and Information Appliances. This is session number 5, Emerging Technologies of Smart TV. Welcome everyone attending this session of Smart TV Global Summit 2012. Four speeches were arranged today. However, the last speaker did not come here. Unfortunately, he had emergency stomach problem last night. So first the 3 speeches will be given today. Today's first speaker is Mr. Chris Osika from Cisco. He's a senior director of Internet Business Solution Group, Cisco System Incorporated. He has more than 20 years of international consulting experience with service providers. His talk is about capitalizing on the next wave of consumer video consumption. Let me introduce Mr. Chris Osika.
Yeah. Great, thanks very much. So let me give you a little bit of background and context. Most people won't know who Internet Business Solutions Group is at Cisco, but let me give you a little bit of context because I think it'll frame how I come up with a lot of these comments and conclusions that I share. So we're a captive consulting practice within Cisco that has 3 functions. One is that we have about 50 people globally that work in the service provider practice. And service provider for us includes not only network service providers, but it includes web portals, it includes media companies, and of course it includes all the cable companies, the telcos, wireless companies, all fall within the context of what we determine as service providers. So we spend about 70% of our time, my global practice spends about 70% of our time directly engaging with customers. So we do regular engagements just like a customer would hire a McKinsey or Booz Allen or one of the traditional consulting firms. Then we spend about 20% of our time doing proprietary research. We do a lot of primary research in the marketplace, covering the areas of video, mobility. We do a lot of work in the area of cloud services, not just on the consumer area, but on the business services area. And then finally, we spend about 10% of our time bringing that back into and actually influencing the own direction of Cisco and our partner companies as well. So it kind of gives you an idea of it's sort of a corporate strategy, customer-facing function. So when I bring up some of these perspectives, it'll kind of give you a perspective of where that necessarily comes from. So let me first share a little bit of market dynamics in terms of what I think is influencing. And I'm not going to spend as much time on the devices or the user interface piece. I'm going to talk about the infrastructure that's going to be required to support what I think is the future of smart TV. So in terms of the market dynamics, let me just put this into perspective of the sheer magnitude of what we're talking about. And when we look at it from a standpoint of devices, you know, one of the things, about 4 years ago, I did a conference. This was just 4 short years ago. And the idea of mobile video was almost a laughing point. So I was sitting at the Consumer Electronics Show, and I was on a panel, and I was with a number of other people from investment community, also from the consumer electronics area, and many of them predicted that consumer video and the consumption of video would be a very minor thing on the mobile platform. Mostly because back then, the idea that we had, it was really the early days of the smartphone, and many people said, oh, well, the form factor would never work in terms of the consumption of video. And this was just 4 years ago. It's 4 years ago this coming January. So 4 years ago, people were not really viewing mobile video as a significant sort of consumption. And then came not only the advent and the acceleration of smartphones and the proliferation of them, but then came the advent of pads, as we've seen. And then also we saw a lot of innovation. Think about 4 years ago, we didn't have Hulu, we didn't have a lot of these other providers. We had a lot of user-generated content. It was all what people called snacking on content. Well, the reality is that the devices have absolutely exploded, plus the form factor has made themselves so that many of these devices have become a device of choice for the consumption of video. And finally, we're seeing from the content provider standpoint, the proliferation of video that's actually being developed and form factored for the mobile device for different types of devices. So all that combined with the fact that you've got online video models that are absolutely exploding has caused this little effect on the right side. I'll call it an effect because in some ways it's a great thing, and in other ways, if I'm a mobile carrier, if I'm a fixed line carrier, it can be a nightmare as well. So as you look at that traffic growth that's occurring on the right, it's kind of daunting if you're actually one of the access providers. So one of the things that we do is we have a visual network index. So Cisco predicts what we think the future of IP traffic is going to look like. And there's a lot of, I'm not going to take you through all the details of this. There's a lot of it available on the web. We do a lot of presentations on it. But the visual network index is often quoted by the investment community and a lot of other sources as a pretty accurate source of fact. I mean, we've been in the market since 2007 forecasting what we thought the future IP video and the future of IP traffic overall looks like. And ironically, between 2007 and 2012, we were off. We actually underestimated it by about 7%, which is pretty accurate for an estimate of that magnitude. But one of the things that I think is very important here is how much of the future IP, now this is looking at internet video right here, internet traffic. If you look at all IP traffic, which includes all of VOD and all the other pieces that included in that because of private IP or managed IP, it actually increases from 54% almost to 86% of all consumer IP traffic is one way or the other related to video. So video is, if I'm a network provider, if I'm an access provider, in some ways it's a great opportunity, in some ways it's a absolute nemesis of their existence. So let me put this into perspective. Let me draw it back to devices again. So when you look at devices out there today, one of the typical consumption devices for online video, and it will remain this way, is the laptop. So even though the onslaught of different pads and smartphones, the laptop continues to be one of the greatest devices for the consumption of online video. The problem is when you look at the laptop, a pad actually consumes about 1.3, 1.4, so 130, 140% of the normal sort of consumption of traffic. When you actually put it on a pad, it increases by that magnitude. Now let me jump to a smart and connected TV. The amount and the magnitude of the traffic goes up to 410%. So when you think about it as a 32-bit laptop, now I've got over fourfold of the consumption that's occurring today in a laptop could occur in the future as it relates to a smart and connected TV. So put that into perspective as to the sheer magnitude. The other thing is we look at the traffic itself. So as you look, the biggest consumption of traffic is consumer. Forget all the business traffic. The business IP traffic, to a large extent, is a tiny little fraction. It's around 12% of the total IP traffic. So think of all the business enterprises going back and forth. It's really minor compared to the consumer traffic out there. Now, when you look at that, by 2016, the amount of overall traffic is about 1.3, 1.4 zettabytes. So what is a zettabyte? I don't think anyone really grasps what a zettabyte is. It's actually 1 trillion gigabytes, to put that into perspective of actually the magnitude of traffic. So that includes all of the internet traffic that has occurred. So 2016, in that 1 year, the amount of traffic that's going to traverse the networks out there is actually going to be equal to all the traffic that occurred from 2012, so December 31st, 2012, all the way back to the beginning of the internet, roughly all the way back to magnitude of like 1984. So as you look at that, that's the amount of sheer traffic and the magnitude of traffic that's going to go on out there. So one of the challenges, and now let me skip to video because I'm going to set up in terms of the opportunity. So video itself, and one of the comments that the gentleman from Amazon made earlier today is that subscription isn't really going away. It's going to take different forms. As you can see, TV subscription is going to continue to grow. Even in Asia-Pac, as we see, now in some ways, some of Asia-Pac is leapfrogging a lot of the Western world in the terms of mobility and some of the other aspects. But when we look at the sheer magnitude of video, and you look at where that's occurring in different markets, but look at the composition of it as well and the monetization. It's going to occur in things like TV ads, of course, but it's also going to occur in subscription, which remains a very significant portion of that all the way to 2016. And as you look at what markets are growing, in South Korea here at 8.8%, relatively slow compared to some of the other markets, but nevertheless a very big area of pay TV and an opportunity for subscription-based TV. So now one of the things that I wanted to look at is, well, what are the media companies lacking out there? When they look at how video is delivered, so we talk about smart TVs, there are still a number of bottlenecks in the system in terms of how they perceive that delivery of video and how what they would like to see actually improved upon. So what drives this, and when you see these different areas, and we had actually gone out, and this was actually about a little over a year ago that we did this work, but what we did is we went out and interviewed a lot of media executives, and we said, where are the challenges, where are the bottlenecks that you see in the ecosystem in the delivery of actual content? And as you can see, we talked to studios and content owners, aggregators, we also talked to networks, and then finally, we looked at large portals, video aggregators, and we said, where do you see the biggest challenges? Not just that the technology doesn't exist, but it may not exist in a way that it is economically viable either. So either one of those drivers could lead to a challenge in terms of the delivery being video. So as you look at this, you look down through digitization and encoding, some of them find challenges. CDN. This is an area in terms of content distribution networks, not just caching. Caching is just the vanilla portion of CDN, but there are many other elements of CDN as well that are incredibly important. Then you look at what other areas in terms of their monetization. And I see two. One is the delivery of video, the content management, but it's also around the monetization, so supporting e-commerce models. So that could be embedded into the future of a lot of, you start seeing embedded commercials, embedded advertising in video, but you also start seeing a variety of different types of e-commerce models that are going to complement video in terms of having consumer products, different types of consumer product solutions that are actually being co-marketed during or possibly after in conjunction, cross-platform, contextual-based ads, all being delivered. Those are very important to the actual media companies and how they monetize the future of media and content. Then you look at three-screen. Not only is it the delivery, and these are areas or bottlenecks. We talked about this before, earlier throughout the day, the importance of what we call really any screen kind of environments, what the future of that looks like. Well, that enablement is far from being complete and far from being ease of use today. So what I'm going to do is now talk about what we think is the case for CDN and CDN federation. So CDNs have been around for actually a very long period of time. I mean, Akamai had been around since before, really at the dawn of the internet days. And as we looked at it early on, Akamai had focused a lot on e-commerce, believe it or not, even before they focused on video. So it actually was the rendering of e-commerce sites and being able to access e-commerce sites even more effectively than it was around video in the early days. Then Akamai, you've got Limelight, you've got Edge Cache, you've got a variety of others, but Akamai still owns the majority of the CDN capability in terms of what we call over-the-top CDNs. Now the importance is, though, that when you talk to media companies, one of their challenges is that, well, number one, Akamai, they tend to view the OTT or the over-the-top CDN providers as being somewhat expensive, also lacking in certain areas in terms of being able to deliver the full content experience that they really are looking for, and also looking at opportunities where can they actually find alternative sources for doing that. So the challenge has been historically that most service providers have all looked at CDN Many service providers around the world have tried to actually make a go of commercial CDN services. The challenge with that is that if you're a content provider, particularly a global content provider, you look at someone that is a local, regional service provider, network service provider, and you say, well, that's great. I can go and contract you for commercial CDN services, but I can only do it within your footprint. And that is, most media companies are global in nature. Most, web providers are global in nature. And that's a major inhibitor from them dealing with a service provider in delivering CDN services. So when people think about CDN deployments, the real opportunity, similar to voice, when people started out with mobile voice, they started out really, think about back in the early to mid 80s, many mobile voice carriers, you had to be on the same carrier in order to talk to somebody on a mobile phone. So really the opportunity is when they federated or basically created roaming models, they actually expanded the market tremendously, and all providers ultimately benefited from that. So that's been largely the catalyst of why we've looked at CDN federation, so the ability for me to peer across CDNs. So if KT and SKT have CDN capabilities, it's the ability for you to peer across them. It's the ability for someone to peer between KT and AT&T or Deutsche Telekom or Orange or anybody, NTT, and depending on how I necessarily can deliver that content, it creates a pretty interesting environment. So there's really a number of models that kind of emerge. One is that you could, of course, strike individual deals with each one of the service providers. So KT could go strike a deal with AT&T or with Orange or with BT or one of the obvious providers. Now that creates a little bit of complexity because each one of the content providers ultimately have to strike deals with each one of the SPs and then work through these bilateral agreements so that it ultimately can flow to you as an end user that actual experience, in terms of actually delivering the content. The problem with that is that it's a little bit cumbersome and it creates a lot of very complex deals. It sort of mirrors what you see in a lot of the DRM or the content management providers. So now, as you see the content flowing there, it can flow in any one of those forms. Now, when you look at an exchange model, this is very similar to what you see in the global roaming environment. So in the voice roaming environments, also what you see in MMS, SMS, a variety of different areas, also what you see in a lot of our plain old internet traffic, how internet traffic is exchanged or peered. Here you look at a central or neutral body that's basically acting as an exchange. Much more interesting environment. Now, the question that many of the service providers have out there is, who's going to be that exchange? What role do they play? What's the remuneration? How does all that work? Then you could see also the emergence of, and you could see where this kind of builds out to all the on-net providers. But what you could also see is the beginnings of hybrid models that take place in both environments as well. So all this is looking at, one of the reasons why we in Cisco are very interested in this is that the health of the industry is you look at that traffic that's going on, you look at what CDN necessarily provides to the end user, the content providers, the service providers, that value proposition is pretty strong in terms of the overall health of the industry. Now, a federation could also take place if I am a multinational conglomerate. So if I'm a service provider that's got capabilities around the world, or if I'm a content provider, if I've got capabilities around the world. So there's a lot of reasons why you would necessarily look at this. So in terms of the business drivers, it's an overall better quality of service. So if I'm Akamai or Limelight or Edgecast, I'm usually sitting out there at the peering points in the network. I'm still quite a number of hops away from the ultimate end user. If I'm actually a service provider like KT or SKT, I can embed that caching capability as well as things like application acceleration, DRM, local regionalization, all the value-added services. I can embed those much further out on the edge of the network, which gains much greater economy and much better experience for the end user. The other is from a content provider. If I'm sitting here and if I'm a content provider, I am eager to get that better experience both from online and particularly as we start talking about unicast models, many of which are necessarily a component or a significant component of our smart TV solutions, I'm going to be more and more worried from a content provider on whether or not I've got the quality of service that's really required in those models. From a service provider, one of the biggest challenges, talk to any service provider, including the ones in Korea. If I have content like YouTube content that's sitting on my network, I can't cache that content. I don't have the ability to cache that for economic reasons to deliver that content to my end users in a more economical way on both my core and edge networks, because it's illegal. I mean, basically you cannot do transparent caching without having a legal relationship with that content provider. So one of the things that CDN Federation provides is that if any of the members within the CDN Federation has a relationship with that content provider, obviously there's an opportunity for you to begin to cache or optimize that content in network, on net. So the economics, and I'll show you in a moment what the economics would play out, are pretty significant. The other aspect is on pure play CDN. So if I am an Akamai, Limelight, Edgecast, any one of these players, I have the ability to partake in one of these CDN federations. It gets me to a much better capital utilization. It also allows them, many of those providers who are now gone well beyond caching, going into a lot of the value-added services, to extend those value-added services much deeper into the network and thus have much greater ability to deliver those value-added services much more effectively. So one of the things in terms of the economics, so this kind of compares, but this is important whether you're a content provider or if you're a service provider. When you compare, let me do a base case. A base case is I deliver internet content, I'm an ISP and I deliver internet content to my end user absent of any CDN capability. So that could be a CDN capability whereby I am basically delivering that content just simply in a model where it's basically, could be any one of the formats, but basically I'm delivering that content relatively native and without any CDN capability. The other is on unpaid 50%. So this says 50% of my content is being delivered. What I mean by an unpaid model, that means the ISP has deployed CDN capabilities and actually done that either for their own content or actually strikes a relationship with the content provider to actually deliver that content with the economics of doing that. So you see you get moved down to 0.93 in terms of the cost structure. That's a cost structure of delivering a per unit of network. Now if I go to unpaid CDN and with a 25%, it's obviously a little bit less. But now if I go to a federated CDN, now there's some assumptions baked in here, but what I am able to do is I'm able to cache a lot more of the content because the opportunity for me to get to 50% is much easier, because once again, if any one of the members of the CDN have that caching relationship or have that content relationship with a content provider, you're able to cache it. The second thing is there's an opportunity for you to monetize. Whereas today, most of the content providers do not want to go out and strike a deal with 20 or 30 SPs around the world to cover most of their footprint. Here I have the ability to actually gain remuneration, whether I am a primary CDN or if I'm a sub-CDN. So if I am the CDN provider, if I'm AT&T and I struck a deal with Disney, and now I'm sitting in KT and they're part of the federation, well, the opportunity is for you to actually share in that revenue sharing as it relates to the CDN and the value-added services delivery. So you can see the economics in terms of why this is important and why this is going to be important, particularly under the circumstances of that pretty strong network growth and network traffic growth. The other thing is, as we look at CDN services, most people focus down on the network cost reduction, which is an important piece. And they also look at things like caching as being really the important aspect of CDN. It is one of the foundational capabilities, but as you kind of move up stack, you quickly start seeing the other types of value-added services that a CDN or CDN Federation capability could deliver, where you get into things like digital locker, the e-commerce capabilities. You also get into things like the end screen capabilities, and for me to be able to deliver those end screen not only cross-device, but potentially cross-market, cross-device. So the ability for me to, and we talked about some of the use cases earlier where I can stop and go in a particular piece of content, where my metadata is very seamlessly shared across the different CDN capabilities. So those are the kind of richness and services that the content providers obviously are very eager and interested, particularly as they begin to embark on new business models. But from a service provider standpoint, it also creates a very robust opportunity in terms of monetization or new or increased monetization going forward. The other aspect is, and this gets back to my mobile voice roaming example, one of the opportunities and one of the things that we modeled this in is as we've done this, and I'm going to take you through why we have this data, is because we actually have done a pilot on this with a number of service providers around the world. The uplift is pretty significant. So when you look at the TAM of CDN services, it's at a level whereby from federating those CDN services, you can get an uplift of over 2x. It's almost like 2.1x of literally looking at the addressable revenue that it creates for the service provider. So very important in terms of actually increased monetization as a particular ISP or mobile service provider. So the other thing I wanted to take you through is what is a CDN federation pilot? So the reason why we've been, again, Cisco is not interested in being a federation, is not interested in being a federation exchange. One of the important things, and we were asked 3 years ago, when we have what's called a global customer advisory board, which includes our biggest service providers and enterprise customers around the world. One of the things that came out of the what we call GCAB about two and a half, 3 years ago was the idea that many of these guys saw this sort of onslaught of traffic coming. Every one of them also looked at the CDN market individually, knew that the economics in an isolated service provider environment just didn't entirely work in and on themselves. So we really got pressed to say, how do you actually bring these parties together and actually prove out what the opportunity is for federating CDNs in the marketplace? So one of the things that has occurred is not only have we done this, Cable Labs in the US has been trying to do it amongst the different cable MSOs. AT&T and BT and a few others have been doing something called OCX. There's a number of other ones around the world that have tried to form. One of the challenges they have is they quickly get tied up in sort of contractual arrangements before they actually go out there and try and learn what the opportunity is in actually federating it. So one of the things that we did back in, and we started this back in 2011, and it actually started, the genesis of this started in 2010. But one of the things we did is we brought together a number of providers, and we purposely chose them on different continents. But what we also did is we looked at 2 tracks to the pilot. One was the technical track. So how does a CDN actually work? Will it work? In an environment that's a multi-vendor environment, because there's a lot of different CDN capabilities out there. The second thing is the business aspect, because we all know that the technology, we've been talking all day, that sometimes the technology works, but the business model sort of brings down the whole capability or brings down the politics of actually making it work. So what we did is we actually brought about a pilot whereby we really broke it into 2 pieces. One was the business track that really kind of dissected all the different challenges that could exist around a business model in CDN federation. And then second of all, we took the technical piece. So we're now in a phase 3, which is going to be starting shortly. But in the first track, we really focused on baseline CDN federation use cases. So I'll show you those in a moment in terms of what those actually look like. Some of not only the queries, how could you do a query in a CDN federated model being handed off amongst multiple CDNs and multiple technical environments and also multiple geographical environments. Second of all, we looked at the business case on that as well. The next piece we did is we enhanced the use cases in phase 2. Now in phase 3, what we're really focused on is not only going after, we've largely not focused on the mobile piece, we've focused on the fixed line piece to date. Now what we're doing is folding in all the mobile piece to it. We're also folding in content providers to actually being part of it. So let me talk to what the findings have been from the federation thus far and what we've all learned. In terms of the participants, where did they see the value in terms of what they could really derive from it? One is around the content providers' more choices of content delivery. So one of the challenges that they've had to date, you'd be hard-pressed to find a content provider, a studio, or any of these guys that are happy with their options today in terms of content management and distribution. It also looked at multiple federation models. So one of the values was a diversity of looking at both domestic models, international, also looking at SP internal group. And what that means is when you have service providers that are multinationals, literally breaking across the opcos, and what that would look like as well. The mix of member sizes, we also looked at ISP CDNs. Some of them had CDNs, some of them were just beginning CDNs. One of the things that we did is we actually did this lab to lab. So in the labs, basically you're able to conduct a full CDN technical trial without having a full commercial CDN actively available. We also looked at differentiated offers based on federated on-net capabilities. So we looked at what could they actually offer as new services to a content provider, whether they're Viacom or one of the major global or international content providers that are out there. And then finally, we looked at both the new revenues, so from a value creation standpoint, what are all the new revenue opportunities, but what are some of the real cost savings that could be derived? And that's where we got to that estimated number up there in terms of what a federated model could actually uplift the industry as a whole. The other thing is that we looked at mobile operators to monetize the data. What we're really focused on now, the mobile carriers, unlike the fixed line carriers, can't just keep throwing more equipment at the network. They have this little constraining factor called spectrum. And they, more than even the fixed line ISPs, are really challenged in terms of how do they actually reduce the burden on the network. So now we're moving into a lot more of the value that a mobile provider could deliver. Also looking at sort of guaranteed delivery, quality of service, and then on the exchange providers. Remember, these are the guys that necessarily could be the hub between the different federated members. And when there is the opportunity, not only can you look at what the monetization looks like for the federation, but how would it actually work from a technical environment, and what kind of challenges would exist from a technical environment as well. So one of the things that we did as well is that we looked at a multi-continent lab-to-lab environment. So here you can see in terms of we tried to actually get content providers on different continents as well and do the lab-to-lab trial. So one of the important aspects here, again, is to kind of test the limits of what could be done in terms of what the value is, both from a query side as well as a content delivery side. So in terms of what we learned from the pilot on the technical and lab track, one is that provided basic and enhanced video, CDN Federation functionality for video on demand. We looked at live video, so live streaming. So one of the things that everyone talked about on the Olympics before, how do you actually take advantage of CDN even in live environments? And then finally on web delivery as well. So each one of those areas or domains was looked at in depth to really understand or be able to test what could really happen under each one of those environments. We also looked at the CDN meshes, including cascaded CDNs. So here you're looking at an environment, for those of from a CDN environment, where you necessarily store content based on dynamic demand synchronization. And so you look at it from a standpoint of not only where can I store content, but where can I purge content as well when I want to dynamically reallocate resources. We also looked at the aspects of dynamic provisioning. So how can I actually provision additional resources for caching and for the value-added services as those are needed? So each one of these areas was really tested in terms of the value as well as the potential of doing that. The other thing we looked at is from an HTTP, we looked at both HTTP streaming, but we looked at time shifting video. We also looked at global and country domestic federations. We also looked at it from a standpoint of DNS-based inter and CDN redirection. And as I mentioned before, also from a dynamic purging. One of the things that you've got to be able to do in a CDN environment is you've got to be able to look at the ability to rebalance the caches not only, again, for content management and distribution, but also for my ability to add to value-added services. Also, we looked at the ability to add e-commerce capabilities cross CDN, cross multi-vendor environments. Again, there's a lot of different vendors that provide CDN equipment out there. You have to be able to operate in that heterogeneous environment. So one of the other dynamics that's immensely valuable that the content providers find woefully inadequate today is around the analytics piece. And this is something I mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of the importance of analytics. But what the content providers are really eager to understand is, how do I get those analytics on a near real-time or real-time basis? So we talked about the Olympics before. So how can I actually look at that environment, be able to reallocate? And by the way, if I'm looking for different end screen capabilities, if I'm looking for different value-added capabilities as it relates to e-commerce, or if I'm looking at abilities to do cross-context personalization, how do I do that and have the dynamic analytics that come back to it? So one of the things that we tested during the pilot, of course, was looking at how transparent those actual analytics are in that heterogeneous environment when I'm working cross-SP, cross-vendor environments. How do I aggregate those up and deliver them either near real-time or in a real-time environment as well? So these are all very important as we look at the future of different content delivery models. How are those going to play out from an infrastructure standpoint? And if I'm a carrier, if I'm KT or SKT, how am I going to optimize my network resources so that I don't necessarily run into a situation where the network necessarily becomes overburdened? So in terms of the next step pilot, as I mentioned some of these already, so one of the things we're going to be doing is obviously involving more of the content providers. And one of the things, what's interesting is many of the other CDN federations that are out there haven't even gotten past the initial planning stages, or they've done content sort of query distribution lab trials on a very limited basis. We're trying to actually do this not only across service providers, so we're looking at probably 12 to 15 service providers involved in phase 3, but we're also looking at one of the major user-generated content providers. We're also looking at and speaking with a number of the actual content providers that are out there, the studios, to really understand their involvement. Now, most of their involvement is really to partake in mostly the business model aspect, to understand how a business model would work and how does that play out in terms of their own needs. But also from a technical environment, what's the realm of the possible that could be delivered to the content provider? The other aspect is around advanced functionality. So now we're looking at flexible CDN selection. So that's the environment of, can I dynamically allocate across different CDNs as I see fit and be able to reallocate as appropriate to do different load balancing? But integration of fixed and mobile, this is another important aspect that's coming in line in the next wave or the next phase of trial. And also cross-federation monitoring and analysis. So we're going to the next level. We were able to deliver query information and the efficacy or the effectiveness of the query information. We were able to deliver that. Now we're looking at the analytics around value-added services and be able to deliver those. Validate scaling. So what we're going to be doing on this is we're going to be simulating certain demand scenarios through a lab to lab, but nevertheless a simulation that's going to be able to tell how well does this model, cross-federation, heterogeneous environment, work when I actually try to scale at a very significant level. And then finally, looking at experimental delivery of real content. So there we're going to actually look at live content and the ability to go outside the lab and actually test amongst live commercial CDNs. And actually want to contribute to the IFT. So one of the things that this federation also does is obviously is very involved with the CDNI standards that are going on as well. So not only playing around what's a business model look like, what could this look like, but also understanding what kind of standards are going to have to be in place for CDNI interexchange as well. And these are all important aspects. So again, just to summarize in terms of what we're seeing, CDN federation is going to be a potential increase of the CDN market in terms of the opportunities. So if you're a service provider out there, it brings a whole new value structure in terms of how you can monetize the network asset. It also elevates the entire quality and the ability for the network to deliver some of the experiences that we talked about earlier today and earlier this afternoon, and deliver that in an environment, particularly in a multinational or international environment. Also in gaming, it's gaining momentum in SPs. So every service provider around the world, including those in Korea, right now are looking very carefully at CDN, also looking very carefully at what's it going to take in terms of me actually federating CDN models in terms of the viability as well as the longevity of a CDN federation. The broader CDN ecosystem, what's important here is how do the network service providers, so the ISPs, work with the content providers, work with the analytics providers, work with all the other value-added players that are going to play out there, because it's a very vast ecosystem that's beginning to emerge out there, particularly as you get into e-commerce capabilities as well. How are those going to work? How are things such as quality of service, quality of experience going to necessarily play out in those as well? Right now, what we're doing as well is we're trying to validate the fundamentals required to make CDN federations a reality. A lot of these service providers that are involved in these, one of the things that we are by no means thinking, and I think everybody discovers this when they get into this, is that there's not going to be one federated model. There's going to be multiple federations that exist out there. There's not going to be one single federation. And we saw this when you look at federation within, the federated model really took off within voice, within mobile voice. It evolved in a very similar way. There's also the idea that cloud is going to begin to get federated, so you're going to start seeing the ability to, you're already seeing the emergence of what are called cloud exchanges. Not so much on the consumer side, you're starting to see them on the business side, the B2B side. Again, you're going to see federated models. The idea of a federation is also going to take place in Wi-Fi. It's beginning to take place in Wi-Fi. So this model exists prolifically in a lot of other areas within the service provider environment and within the whole IP environment as well. So the learnings of CDN, one of the important aspects here is this is influencing some of the standardization boards. So it's very important as you look at where things are going in terms of federation, how that's going to influence the future of standards that take place out there as well. So one of the open standardization solutions are essential. So as we think about federations, they're going to have to be open. It's the only way that we can really make this work long term. So that's it for that. If anybody has any questions at all on it at all.
If you have question, raise your hand, please. 한국어로 질문하셔도 좋습니다. 통역 서비스 되니까. Okay.
No questions.
If you have more questions, please come to the Q&A session after this session.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.